Good afternoon, and welcome to NorQuest College's half-day learning event. As you may know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 2008 to document the history and lasting impacts of the Canadian Indian residential school system on Indigenous students and their families and communities. After concluding its mandate in 2015, the Commission released a 6-volume report totaling more than 4,000 pages of truthful testimony, as well as 94 calls to action in the areas of child welfare, education, health, language and culture, and justice. These reports describe in detail not only the historical and contemporary experiences of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people who attended these so-called schools, but also the legacy impacts that continue to transcend generations. Although the 94 calls to action are complex and vast, they all seek to advance system-level changes by calling on every level of government and every Canadian to take specific action. One specific call to action, number 80, calls on the federal government to work in partnership with Indigenous peoples to establish a statutory holiday to honor residential school survivors, their families, and their communities, and to ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of reconciliation. Tomorrow, September 30th, 2021, NorQuest will be closed to honor and observe the newly created statutory holiday, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which coincides with Orange Shirt Day. Our time away tomorrow is part of a larger commitment to reconciliation and comes in the wake of the uncovering of the remains of more than 6,000 Indigenous children in unmarked graves at former residential schools across Canada since May of this year. Appallingly, we know there are many more yet to be recovered. And while tomorrow offers many of us the opportunity to reflect on today's learning or participate in a community event, there may still be lack of clarity over what reconciliation means and who is responsible for reconciliation. To be clear, we are all responsible for reconciliation. Reconciliation is a complex, multifaceted process, and because of that, many people feel overwhelmed with where to start, what to do, and how to do it. And when will we know reconciliation has been achieved? A good place to start is with the understanding that reconciliation has no finish line. Reconciliation is a journey, and education is a key component of that journey. To quote the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair, "The road we travel is equal in importance to the destination we seek. There are no shortcuts. When it comes to truth and reconciliation, we are forced to go the distance." In considering Justice Sinclair's words further, I reflected on a recent speech by Jody Wilson-Raybould, Canada's first Indigenous Justice Minister and Attorney General, who spoke about the challenge of reconciliation. She said, "It is to be understood that the path of making foundational and transformative change will always be controversial in the Indigenous world and in Canada as a whole. I understand that change always brings with it dynamics of fear and resistance as people realize that they will have to change, that positions of power and privilege may be lost, that new voices, including women's voices, take a more prominent place as old structures, broken structures, Indian Act structures, are dismantled, as economies are restructured and governments are reshaped. But I firmly believe that there is no other way. One does not tinker around the edges of colonialism. One does not reconcile with racism while making little shifts on the side. Colonialism, Indigenous-specific racism, these are the dead roots at the heart of the history of this country, and if we let them remain, as we have, and do not uproot them, the outcome is certainly not a good one. And so today is an opportunity for us to do our part, in a small way, to get at the dead roots of the history of this country by learning from our honored guest speakers about their own experiences of colonialism and the lingering impacts of the residential school system in their areas of expertise and their own lives. Adam North-Pagan will speak to the painful history of the 60 Scoop in Canada and the role this played in advancing the assimilation process. Dr. Felsky-Dirksen will help build our awareness and understanding of the ways in which coloniality has resulted in the racialized oppression of Indigenous epistemologies within Canadian academic institutions. And she will explore how, as white Western-trained scholars and administrators, we can begin to approach and hold epistemic ethical spaces in a good way. Corin Lightning Earl will bridge an understanding of the role of justice and reconciliation, and Dr. Josie Auger will speak to the rights of Indigenous peoples and the resources that are needed as a way to speak for the children that never returned, as well as a sacred connection to knowledge that is the foundation for restoring Indigenous civilizations. And finally, Dolores Cardinal and George Desjardins will explore the role of the resurgence of both Indigenous languages and cultures in advancing the process of reconciliation. Each of our honored guest speakers brings forward critical insights about how we can continue to hold space and advance reconciliation in our own work, in our shared existence at NorQuest College, and in society as a whole. And it is my hope that you were left with more questions than answers, such as, how might we, or how can we? And while I recognize that being left with questions leaves a certain measure of uncertainty about the path ahead, I call on everyone to recognize the hope and possibility that is created in this place of tension and uncertainty. Because it is precisely this place of tension where we can come together to co-create the transformative change that we believe and know to be true and necessary for NorQuest to live and act in right relations as a treaty partner. In approaching the planning for this day, the Indigenous Relations and Supports team struggled with a theme. Knowledge keeper George Desjardins reminded us all of the significance of the events that precipitated us coming together today, which was the uncovering of the remains of 215 Indigenous children at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. He reminded us, He reminded us of the need to not only remember all those who never came home, but to also call these Indigenous children home. The intent of today's event, then, is to advance the TRC Call to Action number 80 by focused learning on the 5 legacy areas of the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, and continued recognition and in honor of survivors, intergenerational survivors, and all the generations who didn't make it home. Our work here today centers Indigenous children so that our current and future generations can know a home in our languages, cultures, and communities. In saying this, it's important then to center the work of the TRC in volume number 4, Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. This specific volume is a systematic effort to record and analyze the deaths at the schools and the presence and conditions of student cemeteries within the regulatory context in which the schools were intended to operate. The Commission has identified 3,200 deaths on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Register of Confirmed Deaths of Named and Unnamed Residential School Students. For just under 1/3 of those deaths, the government and the schools did not record the name of the student who died. For just under 1/4 of these deaths, the government and the schools did not record the gender of the student who died. And for just under 1/2 of these deaths, the government and the schools did not record the cause of death. After reading Volume 4, it becomes clear that Indigenous children were never intended to survive. Volume 4 describes in detail the neglect, abuse, unmanaged, unmitigated yet preventable disease spread, suicide, and appalling conditions that Indigenous children were subjected to for more than a century. The unmarked graves that awakened the national consciousness earlier this year means that we have yet to atone for, commemorate, and honor the children who never came home. Today, we center and honor these children and call them home. We are here, waiting and ready to hold them in our community's collective embrace, so that they are no longer ageless or genderless or nameless, and that their deaths remain part of our collective memory. Thank you for joining us today. Kinanaskmata.